Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Dragon Dreams. My name is Ivan, and I'm going to be talking about tabletop role-playing games, such as Dungeons & Dragons and other games, including the OSR, or Old School Renaissance games. And my focus in this video is going to be on world building. So, I have a few thoughts about world building. I'd like to start out with a reference to one of my favorite fantasy and science fiction authors, Ursula K. Le Guin. People would ask her, how do you get your ideas? And she would always say, well, look, I get it from my imagination. They'd say, is it from your experience? Is it from, from what exactly? And she'd say, look, it's in my head. And I think that's really the place to start. That's where I start, and I hope that's where you start too. So I would say the first step is to dare to be different. Okay, because it's really up to you what you do. And so for example, if you don't want to have dwarves or elves in your game, I mean, those are from Germanic folklore. Right, let's say you're doing like a Greek game. Maybe you have centaurs and satyrs instead of elves and dwarves. Okay, if you're doing a sword and sorcery type game like Conan or one of those kind of games, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser or one of those. A lot of those only have humans. Maybe some of those have maybe just like lizard men or snake men. Okay, so you can have a variety of different settings that have different ideas about what goes in those settings, what makes sense in those settings. In my current game that I'm running, I have this ancient continent called Thera that is now an archipelago because most of it sank beneath the waves. So it's kind of like Atlantis, except that some of it is islands that my players are exploring. And there I decided that I wanted to have the humans there have dark brown skin, straight black hair, and blue eyes. And I thought, well, why not? I mean, I don't really have any particular, human cognate in our world in mind, but it's my world. I can do what I want, and I thought that was kind of a neat idea. They also have advanced technology. They have, but not modern technology, stuff that people would have had in the old days. So they have clockwork, they have steam, they have hot air balloons, they have gliders. And if you want to be weird, I say go for it. But I have some thoughts about how to handle weird. So I decided to go with having a theme, which is the tarot cards. So in my world, I have all these adventures that are based on various different tarot trumps, like the Magician or the Fool. And I have the deities of that world are also the tarot trumps. Okay, so I thought that would be kind of cool and kind of fun. And I think that one reason why I recommend a theme is because a theme kind of helps you tie things together so that instead of just being kind of totally zany and just having no method to your madness, you have something that's kind of this comprehensible package. It might be weird, but it's comprehensible, right? And the other thing is, if you're going to go for weird, just something purely out of your imagination, the other rule, I think, is really the golden rule, is to keep things consistent. There has to be some sort of consistency. Your players may not know what the consistency is, but you should know what the consistency is. And, it could be that the players are just completely baffled, but there's this consistency, this fundamental consistency that is what you have provided them. Okay, so avoid X-Files syndrome. For those of you who don't know what X-Files was a TV show from the 1990s, and it was about the FBI investigating very strange phenomena like aliens and things like that. And it was criticized that seemed like the TV writers didn't really know any better than the audience what was happening. They just kept on dangling these ideas in front of us that, kind of, they had to struggle to tie together. Okay, so I would say do weird, do whatever's in your imagination, but keep it in some way consistent, or in some way have a method to the madness, which you know. All right, that's very important. And think outside our world. Like when I made my world that I'm using right now, let me see if I can show you this. Here's the map that I use. I don't know how well you can see this. But you'll notice from looking at that what I tried to do is I tried to put the continents kind of a little bit different places or a little bit different shapes than we're used to in our world. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to force myself out of that mindset where it's very easy to have, the Western continent and the Northern Hemisphere have kind of like castles and knights in armor and fair-skinned people, right? And then, have the eastern portion of the Northern Hemisphere have kind of like golden-skinned people who have, samurai and Shaolin monks and stuff like that, right? And we kind of know, well, these fair-skinned people with castles are kind of European, and these, sort of Shaolin monk and samurai type people are kind of like something out of like, China or Japan or something. There's nothing wrong with that. That can be fun, but I like to try to mix things up a little bit so that, I just have things just be different. Your world doesn't have to be like this world at all. I like to put in little details that kind of really make the world come alive. And this is good even if you're not thinking outside the box, even if you're not being weird. You don't have to be weird. You can be just totally basic, old-fashioned, traditional fantasy. You could rip off from the best. It could be just like something out of Tolkien or Robert E. Howard or somebody, but I think the things that really make it pop are the little details that your players will remember. Like, for example, throw a festival in to your town. If every culture has festivals. I mean, we have here in America, we have 4th of July. We celebrate American independence. We have, we have Thanksgiving, which, I'm not gonna go too much into. Everybody knows those holidays. So I'm not gonna like do a big long, sort of deep dive into why we have holidays and what they're all about. We have Halloween, of course, that's coming up. People dress up in costumes, right, and go trick-or-treating. So, festivals don't necessarily have to be religious. But I think it's really fun. Like, what if you came back to town after a long, hard day at the dungeon and it's, a carnival with, masks and everybody's dancing in the streets and everything. Sort of like going into, New Orleans at Mardi Gras or something. That would be really neat and memorable. And if it ties into the world, that would be just amazing. Maybe it celebrates when they won a battle or a war against a tyrant or something like that, right? And another thing to consider is put real religion in. I don't mean real religions in our world, but think about how religions work. I mean, I oftentimes feel too much like clerics and paladins and druids are only religious people. And that's just not true. I mean, those people are the religious leaders of their religions. But think about what are religions like? And what are other religions like? You want to do something different. Think outside of the religions we know in the West, particularly if you're in the West, or outside of the religions we know in your area. So, for example, like, here in America, I mean, Christianity is really, really common. Protestant is probably a little bit more common than Catholic. Judaism is pretty common. But, look into other religions. What are they like? What's Hinduism like? What's Zoroastrianism like? What were the ancient Greek and Roman religions like? What was the Old Norse religion like? What were the ancient Celtic religions like? What are some religions in China? And so on and so forth. What are, take some interesting African tribe or South American tribe and just find out something about, what their religion is all about. And there's a lot of different things you could do with that. For example, mostly I think we like to have polytheism in fantasy worlds, just because that seems to be common. But for example, in the Mystara setting of Dungeons and Dragons, it's not a setting that you've probably heard of if you're playing Wizards of the Coast D&D, but in the old days, it was a really popular setting that was the core setting of BX and BECMI Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s. Hi, I'm sorry, my computer froze for some reason, so I apologize for the glitch there. What I was going to say is that whereas in most fantasy settings that you're familiar with in Dungeons and Dragons, there's polytheism, lots of different deities. In the Mystara setting, it was these beings called the Immortals, and oftentimes the Immortals were more like heroes who lived a long time ago. They're being worshipped by various churches and religions. So you could have that. You could have people worship their ancestors. In some religions, like in Zoroastrian, for example, you have a good deity and an evil deity, and then there's a group of Ahuras who are sort of like good angels, and there's this group of Devas who are kind of like demons, and they are at war, and that fits perfectly within the alignment system of good and evil. Not so much the law and chaos, but definitely the good and evil aspect of the alignments that we're used to. That's a possibility. Or you look at something like Hinduism, where they have lots of deities, but they believe that they're all one deity. And there's a distinction in Hinduism, as I understand, and real Hindus will, forgive me if I get anything wrong about their religion, but there are the Devas, who, not to be confused with the Zoroastrian Devas, it's a totally different thing. Okay, the Devas in Hinduism, that's what they're called, same sound, different meaning, are good gods, okay? And all of the Hindu deities you're probably familiar with. Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, Krishna, Parvati, Lakshmi, Kali, all of them are all considered to be good, okay? And there's these beings called Asuras who are kind of like demons, but they're demon gods, kind of, who are considered to be evil or ignorant, kind of ignorant and evil. And because they're not enlightened like the Devas are, is my understanding. And so that's kind of like, your good and evil right there. I mean, literally, that's good and evil right there. So you have that alignment, good and evil. And then you also have the concept of light Devas and dark Devas. So the good deities come in light and dark aspects. And there's a whole spectrum from light to dark. So, like, for example, Kali is not evil, but she is actually dark. Okay? And so that seems like that kind of fits a little bit with the 9 alignment system. I don't know. I don't know if we want to bring a real religion in. I'm not suggesting that we do. But it's inspiration, right? You could have something kind of like that. So there's a whole variety of religions when you really start getting into different religions. Think about philosophies, think about beliefs, think about monks or nuns who might go on a retreat somewhere, or hermits, or are there holy people who wander the land? There's all sorts of neat ideas you can come up with for a really cool religion, and it will really make it pop. Like, one thing that I've done in my setting is I got my bachelor's degree in college in Greco-Roman classics, and I happen to know that in Greece and Rome in ancient times, people typically made offerings to their deities. They didn't just pray to them. They didn't just, have sort of like church services. It wasn't like that. It was like you'd actually pour out a libation of wine, or you'd actually put up things like cakes for maybe like a grain deity, an agricultural deity. They might pour out cream or oil, like olive oil, okay, or honey or something like that. There's a bit in the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus digs a ditch. He wants to pray to his ancestors or worship his ancestors. So he digs a ditch in the ground that kind of symbolizes the underworld. And then he pours, I believe it's oil, cream, and honey into this ditch as an offering. Okay. So, you know, so I actually say you have to have offerings to worship. It's not good enough to just, you know, pray, because it's just a different religion. I just want to give it a different flavor, a different sense to things. And that means that, you know, some items you might need to have traveling would be, you know, like a little kit, you know, incense and candles and, you know, all that kind of thing, right? Or at least, you know, take something from your some wine from your wineskin and, you know, pour it out or something. So you can do all that, and in fact, probably best for a later video. But I am considering some rules around being a devout worshiper. You know, what happens if you're a devout worshiper? Because I think that's really cool. You know, if you're a devout member of a religion, particularly if you know that the gods or whoever, the spiritual beings worshipped are actually real, there's no reason not to be. I mean, you know, and it adds another, you know, whole dimension to things. Okay, technology. That is something that you can really make things pop. Is it medieval? Is it Renaissance? Is it Dark Ages? Is it ancient, like ancient Greeks or Rome, or ancient, you know, Old Norse or Celtic? Do they have cannons, firearms? Do they have open sea navigation? That's an extremely important development in civilizations. If you don't have the ability to navigate by the stars with sextants or quadrants or octants, you have to hug the coastline because you don't know where you're going if you go on the open sea, and that's going to change things dramatically. Okay, I'm back again. Sorry, I had a phone call to take. So I was talking about technology. And you could also think about whether there's clockwork, steam power, you know, wind power, water power. You can have water wheels, things like that. You know, think about food and drink. You know, one thing that really makes things pop is what people can eat and drink. Like in my Thera campaign that I'm running right now, I decided that quinoa, which is this grain that was originally from Peru, would be the staple grain of my area. And I just thought that was interesting. I mean, it's just different. I mean, usually it's wheat, right? Who would have thunk, you know? And so I just have a lot of stuff with that. You can have different fruits or vegetables. So, for example, I have this fruit called ula fruit, which is a purple fruit that is just made up. You can have, you can think about what sorts of alcoholic drinks people have there. So, for example, I have ula wine. They make wine out of ula, not grapes. I have quinoa spirits instead of whiskey or rum or whatever. They have, you know, the grain alcohol they have is made from quinoa, and it's just a different thing, you know. And I also have this drink called mava, which is ground from bark of a tree. I think what I sort of had in my head was kava, also known as kava kava, which you may have heard of, which also is from a ground bark, and basically with kava you just kind of add it to water, and it makes sort of this drink that just kind of relaxes your muscles, and that was kind of what I was thinking, was just it's a relaxing herbal drink, so it's non-alcoholic. Although one of my players decided that he wanted to figure out how to, his character wanted to figure out how to ferment mava, so he can make like a mava ale or something, which I thought was kind of creative. So it's a fun. People are interacting with it. You know you're doing a good job when people are interacting with your world. Okay, government types. Okay, you know the most typical thing is a monarchy, a kingdom. Right, but you don't have to have it. You could have an oligarchy, for example. You could have a state or country that is merchants. It's run by like a little group of 12 merchants. I just pulled that out of my head. Whatever. You could have a republic or a democracy. The distinction I'm making there is that a republic. By republic, I mean a non-democratic republic. You'd have a republic that has maybe each village appoints a representative to go to a council for kind of like a city-state or something, and they each get one vote or something. That would be like a republic. Okay. Democracy would be more like each citizen gets one vote, or they vote to elect officials or something like that. So it's more emphasizing each citizen. But if you actually learn a little bit about some of the ancient or medieval or Renaissance countries, some of them actually were not monarchies. So several examples of that are Iceland has been a democracy ever since it was founded in the Dark Ages. Okay, Florence, the city of Florence in Italy, during the medieval period and the Renaissance, was actually a republic. And there's this great show on Netflix that I like called Medici, which is about the Medici family, the famous Medici family. There's a very wealthy family in Florence in the Renaissance. And it shows how their republic works. And one of the big things is that Cosimo de' Medici gets elected to be one of the members of this council that votes on what will happen with that. You can also have the relationship between religion and the country and the government. Okay, because we're used to, I think in the West, we're used to this idea of freedom of religion. So we have secular states. So, for example, America is a secular nation. There's no foundational religion. It's not a Christian country or a Jewish country or a Muslim country. It's a secular country. In other words, the government does not declare any one religion to be the national religion. Everybody has freedom of religion. But in that's not necessarily the case. I mean, you could have a theocracy where they force you to be a particular religion, or maybe if it's more soft shell than that, there's a national religion that they kind of want you to be, but if you're not that, they're kind of, well, it's okay. But they might kind of, look down on you a little bit. You could also have a state religion, but not have a theocracy. So this is actually pretty common in the olden days. So, for example, like the Kingdom of France, for example, was Catholic. Actually, in the medieval period, all of Western Europe was Catholic because it was before the Protestant Reformation happened. But if you're doing something in later periods, like 18th century, 19th century, or whatever, there were Catholic countries and Protestant countries in Europe, and different kinds of Protestant countries. So, for example, the UK during several hundred years ago was a Anglican country, and in fact, technically, I believe it still is. It's just they have freedom of religion, and it doesn't come up very, very often. But there were times in their history, as I understand, when it's like this is Anglican, and if you're not, and the Anglican Church has the right to lay down the law about religion, relatively strictly. So, and this might not necessarily be fun countries. I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be the good country you start out in. It could be the bad guys. They're like the theocracy that's trying to force everybody to do it. It could be you're in a republic or a democracy that has freedom of religion. and the bad guys are coming in with religious persecution or something. But whatever the case, it's an interesting thing to think about. Okay, and also, is it feudal, which is what much of medieval Europe was? So feudalism is where you have these grants of land by the king, who's kind of like the top warlord, in the region. The person who's be able to conquer everything, and they give the people who help them do the conquering or take over the land or run the land. They give those people land grants and make them lords. Dukes or counts, earls. In England, they have earls. Most of the rest of the places, it's counts, which is the equivalent on the mainland, as I understand. Barons, viscounts, all that kind of stuff. Okay, that's feudalism. Now, in feudalism, land is the main currency. I mean, coinage is not as important as land. So taking land, getting land, holding on to land is really important. But you might also have a mercantile economy, okay, where things are bought and sold. So, like, for example, in ancient Rome, it was more like if you had enough money, you could do whatever you wanted. Now, it's not precisely capitalist. That kind of came in more in the early modern period around, I guess, maybe like I don't know exactly, but I think of like the 17th, 18th centuries as being kind of like when capitalism was coming. I think it actually came in during the Renaissance, maybe a little earlier. I'm not actually up on it. But I know from my classics background that with Rome, they didn't really have, banking and interest and corporations quite the same way that the capitalist economies do. But they had a mercantile economy, and there were extremely wealthy people. In fact, the word crass in English, I believe, derives from this man named Crassus, who in his day was the richest person in Rome. So, you could also have a trading economy. You might not have coinage. I mean, that would be hard, but it might be fun. Where, prior to, like, for example, in ancient Greece, in really ancient times, not the, 5th century Athens when the Persian War happened and things like that, but really ancient times, like when the Iliad and Odyssey take place, was before they had coinage. And so they traded things. They often gave gifts that were very valuable. Like golden tripods come up all the time in the Homeric, in Homer's epics. Okay. And these were things people could trade with each other. So there's a lot of really neat things you could do with economics. You could also just have an agrarian or, agricultural economy or herding economy that's not necessarily feudal as well. So those are some thoughts about some things you could do. And what I would say is, just start out with something basic. Really all you need to start your game is maybe just like a town where people are going to, go off on adventures from and come back to. You might want to provide a little bit of context for that. What kingdom or state is it in? What country is it in? You might want to provide a little bit of information about, what's outside of the borders, so you get a sense of the politics around. I think it's pretty neat, actually, if war broke out or something. I think that might make things interesting, mix it up. Because all sorts of things happen in a war that, terrible things, but things that, trade routes get disrupted and cities might close their gates and not let anybody in, and or it's really hard to get in because they're worried about invaders. All sorts of things can happen in a war. So I think it's neat to know who the other countries are, who the allies are, who the enemies are, or if that can change. If this could change at a dime where they're trading partners and all of a sudden, they could be at war. I think that could make things really interesting. But you really, like when I do my kingdoms, I don't necessarily have that much. I usually have just like a capital city or something like that, and then the borders of the kingdom, and a little bit of information about the terrain. Is it largely forested? Is it a lot of fertile plains where they have fields and things like that? Or is it mountainous? In which case they're going to have a lot of minerals, metal and things like that, mining. So you can think about about that. But you really don't need much. I mean, you could just start out with, there's a town, it's in this kingdom or whatever it is, and boom, go. And then as you need more information, start creating, you know, other towns around, cities, other kingdoms, and kind of branch out from there. So it's really easier than you think, I think. You know, just sit down with some hex paper, maybe some colored pencils, and draw it out, or use your favorite, you know, computer program to just start mapping it out, and just kind of like get yourself a little bit of an atlas. And I have one final thought on all of this, which is that I think the needs for a tabletop role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons are actually different from the needs for a fantasy novel or movie. And the reason is that if you're the author of a fantasy novel, let's say, you know what's going to happen, and the world might be important to the story. Okay, so if you know that, you know, your characters are going to start over here, and then they're going to, you know, travel here, and then they're going to travel here, you sort of build that world around the things that are going to happen. In a role-playing game, you don't know what's going to happen ahead of time. And in fact, really, oftentimes, there aren't really stories. In fact, it's a whole other video, but I don't really believe in making stories or plots. There's better ways to do things. You can create circumstances under which stories and plots will unfold. That's a whole separate topic, which maybe that'll be my next video, I don't know. But, you know, I think that can be, you know, if you start thinking about more in terms of place and space than plot, and what the needs are going to be of that world, a lot more changes. What you really need is just kind of like an atlas. You know, just what are the different countries, what are the towns that you need to care about, or cities you need to care about. You know, and the other thing that you need places for adventures. So, you know, haunted forests, ruins, caves, you know, badlands that are full of monsters or something like that, whatever, things like that, to populate things with, so that there are places for people to go on adventures. Adventures, towns, and wilderness are really only the three things you need to have adventures. Okay, everything else just adds color. I mean, that's not exactly true, because there could be all sorts of interesting things that are going to come up. Hopefully they will, where hopefully your player characters are going to get involved in politics, maybe they'll get involved in, you know, all sorts of interesting things, trade, or who knows what sorts of things they're going to start doing once they kind of get involved with things. But to start out, your real main need is just to have a place for them to go on an adventure, and a place for them to return to that's safe, where they can recover and recuperate. And a lot of interesting things around that, you know, like quinoa instead of wheat, for example, or ula wine instead of grape wine. You know, so if you just think about kind of what's there, just come up with a very simple atlas for your world and a little map. That's really kind of all you need to get things started. And the story will kind of start telling itself. So I don't think that people necessarily need to come up with ideas about what's going to happen. You don't necessarily need to say, okay, this evil, you know, baron or evil prince or whatever, princess or whatever, lives in this castle, and, you know, they're going to start invading. I mean, maybe you have that. But I'm just saying, you don't have to have an idea ahead of time about, you know, first they're going to go here, then they're going to go here, then they're going to go here, then they're going to go here. All you have to do is just put out some possibilities and start them off with, you know, an adventure or two, maybe some hooks for future adventures, and the story will write itself. And as long as they have a neat place that's a fun place to have their adventures, your work is done. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it informative. I've had a lot of fun putting it together, and I hope that in the future I'm going to try to put out a video maybe once a week on a whole bunch of topics that I have in mind. So I'm thinking maybe like doing one on the alignments, maybe doing one on, I already mentioned this issue of, kind of how to put together an adventure without railroading characters into a single plot. So I have several ideas for things that I could do. If you like this video, please like it, thumbs up on YouTube. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, because I'm going to have more coming. And please tell me in the comments what you thought of this. Do you think that these are good ideas or bad ideas? Please be polite. There's no need to be rude on social media. We're trying to have fun here. But you can be honest and be polite at the same time, and I don't mind. You're not going to hurt my feelings if you disagree with me. And maybe share your ideas about what do you think makes a good for good world building in a tabletop role-playing game, and what would you like to see in the future? What sorts of subjects would you like me to talk about, or are you interested in? So have a wonderful wonderful gaming. Great luck to you in your gaming, and I will see you in another video hopefully soon. Thank you very much for watching.